welcome back, everyone, to a foggy day on Olympus, and to our fourth and final episode in our series on crisis-filled 20th century Hungary. Here we look at history, culture, religion, why they matter, and how they brought us here. My name is Rosalind Kalata-Sedra.
And my name is Mike Pierce. Yes, on this channel, we aim to break the algorithms that feed you only your existing opinions, which is another way of saying we are equal opportunities scathing about all factions because the past, just like the present, was messy and confounding of all ideologies.
So you will always find something to complain about in the comments.
And with that, they finally got on with the show.
Exactly. So why are we spending more time on the 1956 revolution than on the next 3 decades?
Well, partly because the next 3 decades were, for Hungary at least, less dramatic, but also because 1956 looms so large in the minds of Hungarians even today.
It's a fund of heroes, villains in the popular imagination today.
Yes, it would be true to say that. So in this map, we're just leaning back a few years to remind ourselves of some stuff we discussed in the previous episode, that Hungary's partial recovery of lost territories during World War II was promptly undone again in 1945, and that the country immediately went back to its mini status created by the hated Treaty of Trianon in 1920.
And that too will be associated in people's minds with the Soviet invasion and the imposition of communism.
Yes, we're going to see that hatred of Soviet occupation and hatred of communism can get conflated in people's minds. They're not quite the same thing. And some people try to prize them apart, but for a lot of people, the two things kind of ran together. Well, here we've got, just to remind ourselves of the bad situation after the end of World War II, a picture of some homeless children in Budapest in 1946. Here we have an execution of a wartime leader, Laszlo Bados. He had been prime minister of Hungary from April 41 to March 1942.
And he had served under Admiral Haughty's regime, right?
Yeah.
Which the regime that had cooperated with the Nazis, however reluctantly, in the attack on the USSR in 1941.
Yes, that's right. And if that wasn't bad enough, as we mention here in this picture, he'd even played ball with the Arrow Cross.
So full-on Hungarian Nazis.
Yes, it's kind of hard to feel too sorry for him, isn't it?
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
So this person we met in the last episode, he was a piece of work, a hardline Stalinist who was in charge in the early years of communist rule in Hungary, and he unleashed harsh persecution on whom?
Yes, he did. He was detested by the bulk of the Hungarian population and epitomized in their minds a Soviet-imposed dictator after World War II. Well, there was pretty harsh repression going on, as there were in all of the newly communist Soviet-dominated states in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And we've borrowed a chunk here from Victor Sebastian's book, Budapest Between East and West, describing this. The terror lasted more than 3 years. The numbers in a small country of fewer than 10 million people were staggering. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 1.3 million people were prosecuted. That's 13% of the population. And half of them jailed. Around 50,000 more were arrested but never faced a charge or appeared in court. more than 2,400 were summarily executed, but many times that number rotted to death in police cells or in the 3 concentration camps that formed the Magyar Gulag, where 40,000 people were interned. And of 850,000 members of the Communist Party in 1950, almost half were either dead, in prison, or in labour camps 3 years later. And often the roles change between victim and executioner with dramatic speed.
So what is going on with that last part? Is that communists attacking and killing other communists like the Stalinist purges of the 1930s?
Yes, very like that. Bear in mind that an awful lot of people will have belonged to the Communist Party not out of conviction, but because it was the only way to hold down a decent job or to progress in your career. So they're not necessarily all convinced communists, but they are going along with it. That remained true in all of these states down to the end of communism around 1990. Partly what's going on here is faction fights and a paranoid leadership trying to protect itself. Lower down the scale, it's personal score settling. You report to the authorities something real or something nonsensical on someone you want out of the way. But it's also the familiar problem because a socialist economy doesn't actually work, but that can't be admitted. And so the failures must be the fault of saboteurs, people secretly working for the West, etc. And so this process goes on very harshly, yes. Now, here we've got a character who's going to loom very large in this episode, and it's Imre Nagy.
And it's important to remember as background, because he counts as a hero in light of what we're about to discuss, 1956, but he had blood on his hands too.
Yes, he did. He had an early biography that was in some ways similar to Rákosi, whom we just mentioned, and also, while we're about it, to Tito in Yugoslavia. That is, he'd fought in the Austro-Hungarian army way back in World War I as a young man, had been captured by the Russians as a prisoner of war, and then he's sitting in a country that undergoes the first Bolshevik Revolution, and he became a communist in Russia. But while he's there, and he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, he was an informant for the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. So yeah, he has blood on his hands. But back in Hungary after World War II, he's pursuing a more moderate line. And he becomes prime minister in 1953 for reasons we'll mention in a moment. But up until then, Rákosi's in charge. He's the hardline Stalinist. Nagy replaces him. And one of the things that he does is to release a lot of political prisoners. But in 1955, he's ousted again by Rákosi's faction.
So this next fella, I know you want to restrain yourself talking about him because...
Because at some point I want to do an episode called something like The Communists and the Cardinals, something like that, about several similar figures in the late 1940s and 1950s in a whole load of the newly communist countries.
But this particular cardinal is too important to leave out of the story. So
yes, he is.
What's the story?
Yeah. So I'm going to try and restrain myself from saying too much, or we'll spoil what we can do at some point in the future.
Nobody remembers what you say anyway.
Oh, the pain.
That's why we record it, so we can watch it over and over.
Oh, of course, yes, thank you. I feel better now. This is why we pay
On
the big
with the
bucks.
actual info.
Right. Okay, well, here is Cardinal József Mindszenty. And we can see his dates here from 1892 to 1975. So by the time the communists really take total control in Hungary, he is about 56 years old. He has been Archbishop of Esztergom. In the ecclesiastical system in Hungary, the most important archbishop is the Archbishop of Esztergom, not of Budapest. It's a bit like in England, the important archbishop is Canterbury, not London.
Canterbury, not London.
Right. Earlier in his life, he'd been arrested by Béla Kun's 5-month-long communist regime back in 1919. And then he'd been imprisoned by the Arakros, the Hungarian fascists, in 1944. And he described both movements as of the devil.
So if he's arrested by both communists and fascists, he must have been doing something right.
Yeah, he must have been doing something right. I think so, yes. But at the end of the day, he is a very traditional conservative Catholic. He just hates totalitarianism and what it's doing to people. And he certainly wants proper freedom for the church. Well, here we've got a rather nice picture of him in 1947, the year before the communists completely shut down everything, in the courtyard of a gymnasium, which will have been like an academic high school.
For everyone who's not speaking German, that's gymnasium.
Gymnasium, yes. But they're called gymnasia here as well. But but gymnasium suggests, people jumping over...
Balance beams.
Yes, that kind of thing, yes. Right, so we ought to say something about the repression of the Catholic Church during these first years of communist rule. So the state confiscated church-owned land, which had been the church's main source of income. It seized control of parochial schools. There are about 3,000 schools run by the Catholic Church. And it banned religious orders, that is, monks and nuns, etc.
I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
This was who banning religious orders? Who closing parochial schools?
The communist authorities.
Okay.
They're doing this really in all of the newly communist Soviet satellite states. Yes. And he was aware that he was going to be arrested pretty soon and probably tortured. And so in August 48, he took the precaution of writing a note in advance stating that any confession wrung out of him on nonsensical charges would be from human weakness and not genuine.
And what confessions were wrung out of him?
Well, the usual absurd stuff, plotting to overthrow the regime, which he wasn't, seeking to crown Prince Otto von Habsburg, the son of Karl, whom we mentioned in an earlier episode, as King of Hungary, and planning a third world war.
All right. The last one might have been maybe a smidge outside of his actual ability.
Yeah, way above his pay grade, I think.
A little bit.
Yes. Not really terribly credible. Well, here we've got a couple of pictures of him. The one on the left is of him at his trial. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 15 years. So I suppose they were going to keep the body in jail for 15 years after death or something like that. Crazy. It was obvious to Western journalists who attended the trial, because this was a show trial, meant simply to justify the sentence that was going to be given, that this guy was a shadow of what he had been a couple of months earlier because of the terrible treatment and beatings he'd had in prison, that was what had happened to him. But nevertheless, there was a large slice of Western public opinion that wanted to think the best about these regimes. Now, I'm including a letter here written by an American Christian, an extremely naive one, as we're going to see, essentially saying, well, what's it to do with us? He should have been more careful, etc., etc. It was published right after the trial in February 1949 by the Boston Herald. Well, there's a lot of Catholics in Boston, so maybe that was part of the reason for the particular interest there. And this is what the correspondent says, I've read with great interest your daily columns and editorials on the Mindszenty case. The average decent individual is always shocked and horrified when an injustice is done to another human being. But I wonder if we look at this case without religious or political bias, whether we should be so terribly disturbed. Mindszenty was found guilty of treason and lesser crimes by the courts of his country. Well, this is leaving out of account, of course, that the courts were hardly
Tortured into
independent.
confession.
Right, yeah, and the courts were not independent. He had been repeatedly warned that his activities looking to the restoration of the monarchy in Hungary, which he hadn't been doing, by the way, would bring him in serious conflict with the communistic laws of his country. He chose to ignore these warnings and kept on with his treasonable activities, which ultimately led to his arrest, trial, and conviction for treason. It seems to me that a man of his great standing in the church, his education, and long training in religious affairs should have been much more careful to obey the laws of his country. Christ said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's," and was never known to have violated the laws of Judea. Christ was never proven guilty of any crime, but was put to death. Mindszenty was found guilty of treason. In fact, it was generally recognized that he was guilty of the charges preferred against him. Then again, I am led to wonder if the world would be so indignant over his conviction if he'd been a simple peasant rather than a prince of the church. This is ironic because Mindszenty's background was precisely in the peasantry, although the authorities accused him hilariously of aristocratic attitudes, whatever those are. I have no love for communism and would give my life to prevent its establishment in America. I'm led to wonder whether this was really true,
that
but okay.
seems a little bit off the mark for the general tone that says, sorry, your problem.
Yes, exactly. Hungary is a communistic country and the citizens there are living under the laws of communism. I believe the Mindszenty case is their problem and that we should not attempt to interfere in the domestic affairs of another nation. Okay. I fear that person spoke for a good many.
I mean, on the one hand, isn't that what people want to hear from the US? Stay out of other people's business. But on the other hand, how can you let massacres continue and just say it's not our problem?
Right. It's I get impatient with arguments made in both directions sometimes, but
And it's exactly where we are now.
yes, it is.
All right, well, in the absence of any solutions to that quandary, let's dive on to the central part of the episode. But I just want to say to our viewers, we raise these issues knowing we are offering you a deeper look into problems without offering you any solutions. We're here to try to build understanding. And if you find that to be enriching your life, please share, subscribe, post on your socials. Help us spread what we hope will be a thoughtful approach to history and to where we are now.
Yes, please do that. There's no point in complaining about ideological trash clogging up the internet if we're not prepared to give a push to something that is different. So please do help us.
Okay, back to the episode.
Okay, first off then, in considering the revolution of 1956, we need to step sideways a moment to consider something that had happened in the Soviet Union. Stalin died in March 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev, whom we can see here, emerged as the General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1953 through to 64.
Why are we stepping sideways into the Soviet Union?
Well, because big shifts in the Soviet Union affected all of the Soviet satellites, whether that was a liberalizing move or a more hardline move. 3 years later, in February 1956, Khrushchev felt secure enough in his position to give a speech universally known as the secret speech, but it didn't remain secret for very long at all, to the Soviet Communist Party Congress, in which he denounced Stalin's monstrous crimes.
And that, you would think, would make Hungary less afraid to talk about communist crimes too.
Right. It has a knock-on effect everywhere. I mean, just to stay with Khrushchev for a moment, he, of course, was implicated in the very crimes that he was now denouncing, although he was perhaps safe in the knowledge that the same thing was true of his audience at the party congress. So they could all nod sagely, perhaps, and simply realize from his speech that it was now permissible to denounce the past, to take a different line for the future, whilst glossing over their own role in it. But yes, it has a knock-on effect in Hungary. So protests broke out in October and riots on the 23rd of October, 1956. This shows a statue of Stalin being brought down. Here we see a tram that has been overturned with slogans written over it. Here we have a bust of Stalin's head being trashed and attacked in the street, I suppose, having been clearly wrenched from whatever plinth it was on. And here a statue of Stalin replaced by a Hungarian flag. And here pictures of Rákosi, the hated Hungarian Stalinist leader, are burned.
Now, the AVO the secret police,
Yes.
were based in the building that is today the Terror House Museum that we saw a photo of in our last episode.
Yes. Visitors to Budapest can go and see where these people were based for many, many years, because it's now a museum. That's right. Well, so that is now attacked by the rioters. These are AVO officers. They're about to be brutally killed by the crowds, lynched. And in this picture here, these AVO men who've just been captured are about to be shot. And in the next picture, they are being shot. Here we've got the body of one of them lying on the ground with someone in the crowd firing a parting shot at the corpse anyway. Here we've got someone who's being strung up. And here we've got a woman with a gun waving at the crowd, perhaps to back off the body of a lynched AVO man. And here in János Kádár, secret policeman, the guy on the left, this is just moments before he was shot dead outside the Budapest Communist Party headquarters. After the building, which is not in the picture, it's just off to the right, was stormed, 23 secret police were shot or beaten to death. So the crowd are absolutely furious at them for what's been going on and how they had to live during the previous few years. So the crowds commandeered tanks, and in fact, ordinary Hungarian soldiers went over to the side of the rebels.
And by rebels, you mean their own people, because these soldiers would only have been soldiers in the first place because they had to be in order to survive, but they would naturally have favored the rebels, their own people,
Yes.
rather than Soviet occupiers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. Here we've got Hungarian troops with their T-54 tanks defecting to the protesters, and the Soviet troops already in the country were simply overwhelmed by the fury and the scale of the popular uprising and the fact that the Hungarian troops were ranged against them. So in the first few days, the revolt was completely successful. Here we've got a picture of a whole lot of people in the street in Pest. And now we come back to this fellow Imre Nagy again. He returned as prime minister. He'd been prime minister from 53 to 55 before being ousted by Rákosi's faction. But right in the first couple of days of the revolt, he is brought back by the Communist Party because they think, well, he can at least placate the crowds. By the way, communist regimes were terrible at this. Whenever they faced any kind of trouble, they would pull all kinds of levers and do all kinds of things just to dampen everything down before going back to the way they were before. But Nagy decides cautiously to put himself at the head of the revolutionaries.
Is he just being an opportunist, or did he actually come to believe in this?
I think he really believed it. It would cost him his life, and he must always have known that that was one likely outcome. In fact, just before his execution, 19 months later, he said that if my life is needed to prove that not all communists are enemies of the people, I gladly make the sacrifice. Now, that might have been naive, but it certainly sounds sincere to me.
Well, he remained a communist to the end, and yet the revolutionaries are wanting to overthrow communism. So what does he think he's doing? I mean, how can he say if my life is needed, blah, blah, blah?
Right.
If he doesn't actually change his allegiance.
Right. Well, because two impulses are seriously overlapping here. The one that will have been most widely felt is to throw the Soviets out, right? So that Hungarians run Hungary. The other impulse that will have been felt by a large majority, but not a minority like Nagy himself, is to bring an end to communism. Right? He wanted a non-aligned Hungary, non-aligned in the Cold War, that was somehow communist without being a dictatorship. Now that was the naivety of it. Any proper election would have seen the end of communism for sure. We might speculate that perhaps he was secretly a Western-style social democrat who was too deeply steeped in Marxist jargon to admit it even to himself. I don't know. Right. But at least in his own mind, he was actually sincere and taking a risk that in the end actually did cost him his life. Well, here he is with the crowds. He was quite popular. And here we've got a picture of some of the insurrectionists taking over the city. Many were very young, not just teenagers, but mid-teens in some cases. This girl, Erika Cornelia Seles, is pretty famous just because a lot of pictures were taken of her like this. I think these have actually been colorized, and she was just 15 and was killed during the fighting later on. Here we've got crowds applauding, a truck carrying insurrectionists through the city. One of the things that I find quite ironic is that Budapest in 1956 was probably as close to the leftist ideal of a genuinely popular revolutionary violence as one could ever find, but it was deployed against the communists, not for them. The damage in the city was severe, and we can see that again here with this barricade and rubble. Here's one of the women rebels walking towards us on camera here, and a couple going back hand in hand after a hard day's overthrowing communism. And a bunch of people here. Again, most of them look very young. And here's a crowd with a trashed tank. Here we come to Cardinal Mindszenty. He was released from prison to acclaim by Catholics and Protestants alike.
So this is a few years ahead of the 1960s, 70s, where there was the Catholic-Protestant rapprochement. Are Hungarians just ahead of the curve, or was it different somehow?
Well, Catholic-Protestant relations were not as bad in Hungary as in many other countries. But the real point is that Mindszenty is a religious leader, any religious leader, who's been tortured and imprisoned for his faith and for his anti-communism. So for the crowds, what specific flavor he is kind of irrelevant. He represents normal life, both before and they hope after communism. And here we've got a picture of him giving a speech on radio after his release.
So this ends badly, does it?
Yes, it does.
Locally based Soviet forces were crushed. And now what happens?
Well, Khrushchev's going to send in massive reinforcements. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. He didn't want to trigger World War III. And Western radio stations were beaming encouragement to the Hungarian rebels, telling them falsely that help was on its way. If that sounds awfully familiar to very recent developments in respect of Iran, well, there you go. But this was happening just at the moment when the US was having a rare falling out with Britain and France over the Suez crisis. And in the end, Khrushchev calculated correctly that the Western powers would do nothing to stop him. And so, after some hesitation, he made the decision to send in massive reinforcements. So, when on 4th November the Soviets return, the revolutionaries faced an impossible challenge. And here we've got a picture of Soviet tanks coming in. And again here in central squares in the city. And another one here. The street fighting was severe, but the outcome could hardly be in doubt. And here we've got local people mourning over the makeshift grave of a fallen fighter. And a whole lot of carnage in the street here. Imre Nagy could see that the revolution was going to be crushed and that his gamble, if that's what it was, had failed. And so he makes a last appeal to the Hungarian fighters, but also to international opinion. And this is what he sends out on November 4th. This fight is the fight for freedom by the Hungarian people against the Russian intervention. And it's possible that I shall only be able to stay at my post for 1 or 2 hours. The whole world will see how the Russian armed forces, contrary to all treaties and conventions, are crushing the resistance of the Hungarian people. They will also see how they're kidnapping the Prime Minister, he means himself, of a country which is a member of the United Nations, taking him from the capital. And therefore it cannot be doubted at all that this is the most brutal form of intervention. I should like in these last moments to ask the leaders of the revolution, if they can, to leave the country. And indeed, many thousands of them did. They fled over the border into Austria. I ask that all that I have said in my broadcast and what we've agreed on with the revolutionary leaders during meetings in Parliament should be put in a memorandum, and the leaders should turn to all the peoples of the world for help and explain that today it is Hungary, and tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, it will be the turn of other countries, because the imperialism of Moscow does not know borders and is only trying to play for time.
And we are in essentially the same place now with Ukraine.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I mean, it's a frequent saying inside Russia, communism may be long gone there, but Russia does not have borders. Wow.
All right. So what happened if we're in the same place? Let's see where it went.
Okay, well, before we proceed, can I wave at our viewers here 3 books which they might find helpful. This one's by Michael Korda, and it's called Journey to a Revolution. This one by Paul Lentvei, One Day That Shook the Communist World. And this one by multiple authors, 1956, The Hungarian Revolution and War for Independence. I think War for Independence is over-egging it a bit. It only lasted in total about 2 weeks. but still, it's a very useful volume. Yeah. Okay, so now we need to look at the aftermath. And to begin with, let's just tilt back here to a character we mentioned many times in the last couple of episodes, but who
Our
wasn't.
guy, Admiral Haughty,
That's him. Yes.
he was still alive at this point.
Yes, but only for a little longer. Um, he died 3 months later. Admittedly, he was in his late 80s, but I suspect that his incredible sadness at the crushing of this revolution may have hastened his end. What we've got here is his autobiography, his memoirs, A Life for Hungary. He had been Hungary's interwar leader. At this point, he was living in exile in Portugal, and he was anguished by the crushing of the revolution. And he requested that after his death, his body not be returned to Hungary until the last Russian soldier had left. And in 1993, that request was fulfilled. But you can see here he's 88, actually.
When he passed?
Yes, yes.
Hey, spring chicken compared to you.
Ah, shh.
So what is his autobiography like? Is it worth reading?
It is worth reading. Like so many autobiographies, he's attempting to give self-vindication.
Justification for himself?
Well, to vindicate his actions, and that took some doing. This is a guy who had, after all, played ball, however queasily, with
With
Hitler.
first Hitler and then the Arrow Cross.
No, he never played ball with them. He tried banning them, and they were sort of went along with ousting him from power. So he could at least claim that. But he had been an anti-Semite, and he, like I say, he had allied himself with Hitler really to recover Hungary's lost territories. But the whole enterprise ended in disaster. One of the things I kind of like best in his autobiography, he talks about much earlier in his life when he got to meet Emperor Franz Josef. And he says he was the best man I ever met. And when in later years I was in charge of running Hungary and faced all kinds of difficulties, I would often ask myself, what would Franz Josef have done? I kind of like that.
It does make you wonder why he didn't give the throne back then, but never mind.
Yes, yes. Okay, so here we've got a picture of the Serbian embassy, which today, which is just off Heroes Square, which has a whole lot of statues of people who, in modern Hungarian consciousness, constitute national heroes. In 1956, this building was the Yugoslav embassy, and Imre Nagy fled. He took refuge there. Now, remember that Yugoslavia at the time is governed by Tito, so another communist state, but it's broken with the Soviet Union, so it's kind of independent. And Nagy thought, well, they would be exactly his kind of people. But he was enticed out not too long afterwards with promises of a safe conduct. And of course, the promise was completely worthless, and he was arrested. And that brings us to this man, János Kádár.
Another slippery character.
Yes, he was. He was the leader at this point imposed by Moscow. He had been imprisoned, actually, in the early 1950s when Rákosi was in charge, this period when communists were mistreating other communists and locking them up and all these faction fights. And after Rákosi was overthrown and Nagy had come into power the first time in 1953, he'd been released. And Kádár duly thanked Nagy. And Nagy had said to him at that time, well, if my turn ever comes to be locked up, you need to remember this and release me. But that's not what happened. Indeed, in the early few days of the revolution, Kádár had supported Nagy's reforms, but a few days later concluded that it was going to fail. And so he switched sides to support Moscow and then becomes the man that Moscow installs. And he's finally responsible for Nagy then being arrested.
Condemned to death.
Condemned to death, yeah. Here is Nagy at that trial, a secret trial in June 1958, so about 18 months after all the hullabaloo is over. The other person we need to mention, of course, is once again Cardinal Mindszenty. Mindszenty had been imprisoned from 48 until the revolution happened in 56, brought out of jail.
15 years in one building?
Yeah, he takes refuge in the American embassy, hoping that it's just going to be for a short time, but he's in there from 1956 to 71. So it's almost like another prison for him. But he knew not to trust promises of safe conduct from the regime. In 1971, and a lot of water's passed under the bridge by that point, there's another pope in charge in the Vatican, that's Pope Paul VI, who wanted to pursue a policy of some kind of modus vivendi with the communist governments.
So he would have felt betrayed, I would think, if the Pope is trying to ally himself with communist governments.
Well, he wasn't allying himself, but he was turning down the heat on Catholic anti-communism. And part of the quid pro quo was that Mindszenty be released and allowed to come to the West, but that he be stripped of his offices as Cardinal and as Archbishop of Esztergom, which Mindszenty refused. But he couldn't do anything about it. And in the end, he was bundled out of the country. He meets Paul VI, as you can see here in this picture, but he did feel betrayed by him. He saw out his days in a monastery in Austria overlooking the Hungarian border. Died in 1975, but not before completing his memoirs of what was truly a tumultuous life.
Which is how you know he felt betrayed by the Pope?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who knew him could have deduced that for themselves. He was not someone for bending, and he had sacrificed so much for what he believed.
Now we're on the decline?
Yes, we're going to look very briefly at these last 30 years and how this all ends. So let's say a little bit about Kádárism. János Kádár, the guy Moscow has put in charge. What does he do? He knows that everybody in the country he's got to rule hates him. He's utterly detested, and he needed heavy security everywhere he went. And there was an initial crackdown on anybody who had supported or participated in the revolt. Many, as we've said, got out of the country. So there were a number of people who were executed, many more imprisoned. But once that was over, he sought to ease internal tensions. So he persuaded Moscow to reduce its heavy military presence and to maintain low visibility, keep soldiers in barracks as much as possible so that they don't come onto the streets and are immediately hate figures and liable to be attacked and all kinds of incidents that will flow from that kind of thing. And he took loans from the Soviet Union in order to increase Hungarian wages by 15% in 1957, the year after the revolution. Now, from our point of view, this is laughable. It was just the kind of thing that communist governments did when they were in a bind, right? If by some mad decree in Canada, the US, Britain, or somewhere today, governments were to increase everybody's wages by 15%, all prices would leap up by 15% tomorrow morning. This is obvious, right? But in communist regimes, things don't work like that. prices, productivity, availability of goods, assignment of jobs. All this is done by command. It's a command economy. So this was one way of pacifying people who are angry. He then went on to encourage some private trading and professions like plumbing and electricians, as well as in the countryside, even a few private farms. And as you and I could have predicted quite easily, they produced far more proportionally of their share of Hungarian GDP than the state sector. Like, who'd have thunk, right?
That would only be possible if the party is coming to an end. They know they're coming to an end, so they attempt to liberalize themselves to stay in office.
This happens well before the end of communism. So trying to create a softer form of communism where most things are still in state hands, but there is at least, chinks of light there, some little freedoms, a
Like
boost.
private business.
Yeah, a boost to the GDP. That's right. But later on, nearer the end, dissidents were actually allowed to meet and discuss, but discreetly, as long as the authorities calculated that they couldn't actually influence public policy or anything like that. So they could meet and talk and blow off steam amongst themselves without being arrested for it. So the regime got softer the further on you went. Here we've got a picture of a little girl's first communion dress in Najbarachka in 1985. Now, 1985 is the year that Gorbachev takes power in the Soviet Union and embarks upon a liberalization program there. You can now actually participate in churches without losing your job for it or facing some other penalty. And here, right near the end of communism in Hungary, Imre Nagy's body is reburied with public honours on the 16th of June 1989. And there are various speakers at the funeral, one of whom was a young Viktor Orban, who demanded democratic elections and the withdrawal of all Soviet troops.
Even this, honoring Nagy, is possible because of this liberalization that's happening at the tail end of the communist occupation of Hungary.
Yes, everybody can see at this point that communism is rapidly coming to an end, and communist parties everywhere are drastically liberalizing themselves in doomed efforts to stay in office. Even this, honoring Imre Nagy, is possible. Well, we saw János Kádár around the time he came to power in 1956. Here he is as an old man, and several weeks before his death of cancer, on 6th July 1989, so just a month after the picture we just saw, he had called for a Catholic priest. He knew he was dying.
A Catholic priest.
Yeah.
So they don't even believe what they're selling.
No. He's far from the only such person. When Erich Honecker, the East German dictator, went into hiding after the dictatorship there collapsed, who did he take refuge with? A Protestant pastor, because he knew that these were good people who would take care of those who were in trouble. At the end of his life, Hitler said the German people had failed him. And even today, there are authoritarian leaders who clearly despise the countries they claim to be making great again. People like this don't actually believe their own stuff. It's only ever about power. And Kádár died the day that Imre Nagy was formally rehabilitated by Hungary's Supreme Court. Now, here we've got a very touching picture of widows at the posthumous award ceremony of the victims of the 1956 revolution. So all of this is sayable now. And just to wrap up here, in October of that year, the Communist Party reinvented itself as the Hungarian Socialist Party and sets up multi-party elections and separation of powers. It's accepted that the game is over. 5 months later, in March 1990, the first democratic elections actually happen. The centre-right party comes first. It doesn't quite have a majority. It has 164 seats out of 378, whereas the socialists, the reinvented communists, come fourth with just 33 seats. Interestingly, Fidesz, which was then a liberal centrist party led by the 26-year-old Viktor Orban, came fifth with 22 seats.
And back then, at the creation stage, Orban wasn't hard right at all.
No, another political opportunist who has changed his spots as the years have gone on.
And this is what prompted us to do this whole series at this pivotal
Right.
time.
Yeah, exactly so. Well, in June of the following year, the Soviet troops finally left Hungary. 3 years later, the socialists made a comeback in 1994 elections. This is not too surprising because when you get rid of socialism, things do not immediately get better. I'm saying this to upset both socialists and free marketeers, right? The biggest mistake that Western advisors made was telling people in the disintegrating Soviet Union to go for what they called shock therapy. Mistake. If you dismantle socialism, things will eventually get much, much better. But the first thing that happens is that your existing structures fall apart. However badly things are being made, however little, however inefficiently, there is at least something being made, and that's now being blown away. So the economy actually declines before it hits the bottom and comes back. And so the pain is experienced by people in countries that have ceased to be communist. And that caused an uptick in socialist fortunes in the mid-1990s in quite a few formerly communist countries. But by then, the dynamic was so clear, things were getting in the longer trajectory better and better, that it didn't stay that way. Right? But in the following years, right-left divisions in Hungary were more bitter than in most countries. And following a 1997 referendum that gave more than 85% support, Hungary joined NATO in 1999. And in 2004, it joined the EU.
It has been a pivotal time with Orban leaving office, and we hope that we have helped you to understand the history behind that change a little better. Mike is coming back on our next episode with a new series on the Renaissance with a new co-host, Alistair McKittrick. So I will be back again in August for a new series, and we hope to see all of you every episode where we take apart the mess that is history and follow each piece to how we wound up with the mess that is today.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, for people who are getting confused, we are into co-host leapfrog here. So while we're about discussing our wonderful new team, we should also give a shout out to our technical assistant, the technical manager, enabler, Philip Vasilyevich. So yes, Rosalind is going to be doing every other series, and the ones in between, we're going to be having Alistair McKittrick, starting with the next episode, the beginning of a new series on the Renaissance.
And with that, we bid you goodbye, and we'll see you next time.
Yes, exactly. Au revoir from the channel for grown-up discussions, for grown-up people. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye now.